There are 6 countries on the southern shore of this sea. Between them, they hold some of the largest oil reserves on Earth, some of the tallest towers, and some of the newest cities ever built. And not one of them has a river. No permanent river runs across Saudi Arabia, none across the United Arab Emirates, or Qatar, or Kuwait, or Bahrain, or Oman. No lake you could drink from. In most of these countries, a whole year of rain would not fill a bathtub for each person who lives there. By the measure the United Nations uses, they are not simply short of water. They fall below the line it calls absolute scarcity, the point at which there is not supposed to be enough for a modern life to be possible. And yet, these are among the thirstiest nations on the planet. In the desert, there are lawns. There are fountains that run through August when the afternoon air touches 50 degrees. There are swimming pools and green golf courses and cities of glass that use more water per person than almost anywhere else on Earth. One of them, Saudi Arabia, ranks 3rd in the world for water use per person, behind only the United States and Canada. Both of these things are true at the same time. 6 countries with no fresh water of their own. 6 countries that drink more of it than almost anyone. The water has to come from somewhere, and there is only one place near enough for it to come from. It comes from the sea they are standing beside, a sea too salty to drink. They pull it in, strip the salt out of it, and push it into their taps. Between them, these 6 countries now produce around 40% of all the desalinated water on the planet. In 2 of them, Qatar and Kuwait, very nearly every drop that leaves a tap began only days earlier as seawater. This is the story of how a sea became a supply, how 6 desert nations came to drink an ocean, and what happens to an ocean when you do. The sea has many names. On one shore, they call it the Persian Gulf. On the other, the Arabian Gulf. To the people who have lived on its water for thousands of years, it was simply the sea, the thing that gave them everything and asked for a great deal in return. It is not a large sea, and it is not a deep one. From the marshes in the northwest to the narrow gate in the southeast, it runs less than 1,000 kilometers. In most places, you could stand a 10-story building on the seabed, and its roof would break the surface. The average depth is only about 35 meters. It is, in the truest sense, a shallow, warm puddle of the Indian Ocean, held in a shallow bowl between 2 continents. And because it is shallow, and because it sits under one of the hottest, driest skies on Earth, the sea is slowly being cooked. Nearly 2 meters of water evaporate off its surface every single year. Almost no rain falls to replace it. Only one real river reaches it. So the sea does something most seas do not. It loses fresh water faster than it gains it, and everything left behind grows heavier with salt. The Gulf is saltier than the open ocean. In its shallowest corners, saltier still. This is a sea that is, by its own nature, always trying to become salt. Which makes the oldest human story here almost impossible to believe. Because long before anyone learned to unsalt this sea, people were already drinking it. Off the coast of one small island, in the shallows where the seabed is close enough to touch, fresh water rises up through the salt. It bubbles out of the ground beneath the sea, cold and sweet, and spreads for a moment before the salt swallows it again. Sailors learned where these springs were. They would row out, push a leather bag or a length of reed down to the seabed, and draw up drinking water from the middle of a saltwater sea. The island is Bahrain. Its name in Arabic means the two seas, the salt one you can see, and the fresh one hidden beneath it. The people who lived here 4,000 years ago built a civilization on that miracle. They called their land Dilmun, and in the oldest written stories of the ancient world, clay tablets pressed in Mesopotamia, Dilmun is a blessed place, a garden, the one country the gods had given sweet water. They believed that beneath the whole world lay an ocean of fresh water called the Abzu, ruled by Enki, the god of wisdom and of water. And they believed that in Bahrain, the Abzu broke through the floor of the salt sea and surfaced. They were not entirely wrong. The truth underneath the myth is almost as strange. Thousands of years ago, Arabia was a wetter place. Rain fell on the mountains far inland and sank into porous rock, into vast underground layers we now call aquifers. That water has been traveling downhill through stone ever since, slowly for millennia, until it reaches the coast, and in a few places forces its way up through the seabed. The sweet springs of Bahrain are ancient rain, surfacing at last, thousands of years after it fell. For the Dilmun people, and for everyone who came after, those springs did two things. They gave them something to drink, and they gave them the water that made this stretch of sea the richest oyster ground in the world. Because pearls formed here, the Gulf's warm, shallow, spring-fed shallows were perfect for a small oyster, and inside a small fraction of those oysters lay the thing that would define this coast for 4,000 years. A pearl is an accident of defense. When a grain of something sharp works its way inside the shell, the oyster cannot remove it, so it does the only thing it can. It wraps the intruder, layer after microscopic layer, in the same smooth material it uses to line its own shell. Thousands of layers, years of them. Slowly, around the wound, a pearl grows. For most of recorded history, this was where the world's finest natural pearls came from. Not from the land, from the sea floor, one oyster at a time, and every one of them had to be carried up by a human being holding his breath. Whole towns lived off that breath. On the island of Muharraq, the pearl merchants built tall houses of coral stone, crowned with wind towers to catch what breeze there was, and the divers, the rope pullers, the captains, and the singers who kept the rhythm on the boats became a single machine that put to sea each summer. At the height of it, thousands of dhows worked these banks. The pearls they raised traveled to the jewelers of Paris and Bombay and New York, where a single strand of Gulf pearls could be worth a house. For 4,000 years, this was one of the few things the outside world wanted from this coast, and every last piece of it came up from the sea floor in a diver's hand. The pearling season was called the Gauss, and it was brutal. For 4 months in the deep heat of summer, wooden ships, dhows, sailed out to the oyster banks and stayed there. A diver would fill his lungs, clip a stone to his foot to sink faster, and drop 10, 15, 20 meters to the bottom. He worked in the dark with a basket and a clip on his nose, feeling for shells, for as long as a minute and a half at a time. Then he tugged the rope, and a second man hauled him up, and he did it again. 50 times a day, 100. The sea took its price in bodies. Divers went deaf from the pressure. Their eyes clouded. Their lungs and hearts gave out young. Sharks and stingrays and a jellyfish season that could paralyze a man were part of the water. And the ones who survived the sea did not necessarily escape it, because most divers dove in debt, advanced money by the captain against a season's catch, a debt that could pass, unpaid, from a father to his son. A man could be born owing the sea and die owing it. And then, in the space of a few years, the whole thing ended. It is the late 1920s. In Japan, a man named Kokichi Mikimoto has spent decades learning to do deliberately what the oyster does by accident: to place a seed inside the shell and grow a round, even pearl to order. The cultured pearl arrives on the world market at a fraction of the price of a natural one, and it is very nearly identical. Within a few years, the price of natural Gulf pearls collapses. The Great Depression takes the buyers who remain. The oyster banks that had fed this coast for 4,000 years fall silent, not because the oysters were gone, but because the world no longer needed them. The pearling towns emptied. Families who had lived on the sea for generations had nothing. There is no gentle way to say what that decade was on this coast. It was hunger and the sudden loss of the only trade anyone knew. The sea had given, and then, through no fault of the men who dove it, the sea stopped paying. What saved this coast was not the sea. It was what lay under it. Within a few years of the pearl market's death, the first oil wells came in, and the story of the Gulf changed so completely that the pearling era vanished from the world's imagination almost entirely. But the pearl divers left something behind that mattered more than the pearls. They left 4,000 years of knowledge about a single, unforgiving fact. On this coast, the hardest thing to find has never been wealth. It has been a drink of water.
To understand how scarce,
You have to go to the one place in this whole basin where fresh water arrives in real quantity and see how far away it is from everyone who needs it. In the far northwest, where Iraq meets Iran and Kuwait, two of the oldest rivers in human history come together. The Tigris and the Euphrates, the rivers that watered the first cities on Earth, join near the top of the Gulf and empty into it through a single channel called the Shatt al-Arab. This is the sea's one true river. Nearly all the fresh water the Gulf receives from the land arrives here, at this one corner. Around that river mouth lie the great marshes of Mesopotamia, a green world of reed and water and buffalo in the middle of the desert, home to communities who have lived on floating islands of reed for 5,000 years. For most of history, this was the exception that proved the rule. One wet corner in a basin of thirst. But even that corner is thinner than it was. Upstream, dams and cities and farms across several countries now take their share of the Tigris and Euphrates before the water ever reaches the sea. The marshes have shrunk, refilled, and shrunk again. Less fresh water reaches the Gulf than once did, which means the sea, already trying to turn itself to salt, has even less to dilute it. The one river that could soften this sea is quietly being spent before it arrives. So this was the situation 100 years ago for the people living along the southern shore. A sea of salt in front of them, a desert behind them, one distant river they did not control, and a few sweet springs that were already, even then, beginning to run dry as the towns above them grew. The place where the modern answer began was Kuwait, a small trading town at the top of the Gulf on the wrong side of the sea from the one river. For centuries, Kuwaitis had lived on rainwater caught in cisterns and on brackish wells that were barely drinkable. And when that failed, they went to fetch water the only way they could. They sailed for it. Picture the water fleet. Every day, a line of wooden dhows crosses roughly 100 kilometers of open gulf to the Shatt al-Arab, fills its holds with river water at the one place it flows free, and sails back. In the years before the Second World War, dozens of these ships were making the crossing. One count puts it at 49 large dhows, carrying tens of thousands of gallons of drinking water a day for a town that could not survive a week without them. Water arrived in Kuwait the way cargo arrives at a port. It was unloaded and carried through the streets and sold by the tin. It was not enough, and everyone knew it was not enough. A town cannot become a city on water, it has to import by boat. And so Kuwait did something that had never been done anywhere in the world as a matter of national survival. It decided to make its own. The year is 1951. On the shore at Shuwaik, Kuwait switches on the first plant on Earth built to turn seawater into drinking water for an entire population. The idea itself was old. You boil the sea, catch the steam, and let it cool back into water without the salt, which is simply what the sun does over the whole Gulf every day, done deliberately in a box. In the city of Jeddah, across the peninsula, people had a name for the machine that did it. They called it the Kindasa, their own worn-down version of the English word condenser. But Kuwait was the first to bet a country on it, to make manufactured water a matter of state. It is worth understanding what happens inside those plants, because it is not one trick, but two. The oldest Gulf method simply speeds up the sun. Seawater is heated until it flashes into vapor. The vapor, being pure, leaves the salt behind, and the vapor is cooled back into fresh water, stage after stage, each stage held at a lower pressure, so the water boils again and again from the same heat. The newer method never boils anything at all. It forces seawater at enormous pressure against a membrane so fine that water molecules squeeze through and salt cannot follow. The Gulf leaned for decades on the boiling method, partly because the energy to run it was the cheapest thing in the region, and partly because Gulf water is so warm, so salty, and so thick with life that it clogs the fine membranes of the other kind. And almost everywhere, the plants were built joined to power stations, the same furnaces making the electricity and the water at once. Two needs met by a single fire on the shore. You can read the whole arrangement in the skyline of Kuwait City, where a cluster of tall, round-bellied towers stands over the water. They are not decoration, they are storage. The manufactured water held up high so it can fall through the city under its own weight. A country that once counted its water by the Dow load now keeps it in towers you can see from the sea and runs two separate networks of pipe beneath its streets. One carrying the pure desalinated water people drink, and one carrying brackish groundwater for washing the streets and greening the parks. The two blended and divided so that not a liter of the expensive kind is spent on a lawn. Out in the Gulf, on the low island of Failaka, the ruins of a Dilmun settlement and a Greek fort left by Alexander's admirals still stand above the waterline. One more layer of people who lived on this coast because somehow they found a way to drink. Once one country proved it could be done, the whole coast followed, because the whole coast had the same problem, and thanks to the oil, suddenly the same means to solve it. Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Oman. One by one through the following decades, they built plants, then bigger plants, then some of the largest industrial water complexes ever constructed. The dhows stopped sailing for water. The tins disappeared from the streets, and the tallest towers on Earth began to rise over a coast that within living memory had counted its water by the barrel. There is a strange symmetry in it. For 4,000 years, this coast made its living by sending men to the bottom of the sea to bring up something rare and precious, one piece at a time, by holding their breath. Now it sends the sea itself up a pipe by the millions of tons and takes something even rarer out of it. The harvest changed, the sea did not. It is still the same water that drowned the pearl divers. It is only that now, instead of pearls, it gives up the one thing the pearls could never buy: a drink. But a sea that must be manufactured into water is a fragile kind of miracle, and nowhere is that fragility clearer than in the smallest, most dependent of the six. Qatar is a peninsula the size of a small province, pushing north into the Gulf. It has no mountains, no rivers, and almost no natural fresh water at all. And it has built, in half a century, one of the wealthiest societies on Earth on top of that emptiness. To do it, Qatar has become the most water-dependent nation in the entire region. Over 99% of its drinking water is manufactured from the sea. Very nearly every glass of water in the country was seawater a few days ago, which raises a question the country tries not to think about too loudly. What is behind the tap? The answer is not much, and not for long. Manufactured water is made and used almost in the same breath. There are no great natural reservoirs holding years of supply the way a river-fed country keeps water behind a dam. For the smallest Gulf states, the entire national reserve of drinking water, everything stored, everywhere, at once, amounts to only a few days. If the plant stopped, the taps would not run dry in years or months. They would run dry in days. A society of skyscrapers and highways rests at any given moment on a buffer thinner than a long weekend. And still the fountains run. This is the part that is hardest to hold in your mind, that the same coast which lives days away from thirst has made a public art of spending water. To see it fully, you have to go to the place that turned the paradox into a skyline. Dubai grew out of a small creek on the Trucial coast into one of the most visited cities on the planet in about 2 generations. And everywhere you look in it, there is water where the climate says there should be none. Fountains taller than buildings, lawns kept green in a place that sees a few centimeters of rain a year. Artificial islands shaped like palms and continents pushed out into the shallow Gulf. An indoor ski slope cooled below freezing in a desert. It is tempting to read all of this as simple excess, wealth showing off. But that is the wrong way to see it, and it misses what is actually strange here. Every drop in every fountain, every liter keeping every lawn alive, is seawater that someone lifted out of the Gulf, heated or pressed until the salt let go and pumped inland. The green is not a sign that water is abundant here, it is the opposite. The green is the most expensive thing in the desert, made real only because the country decided that the sea would be turned into whatever the city wanted it to be. What looks like a story about money is, underneath, a story about water, and about a coast so certain of its power to unsalt the sea that it now grows gardens on top of it. It reshapes the sea in more literal ways too. To build the palm-shaped and world-shaped islands, dredgers pulled millions of tons of sand and rock from the seabed and piled it into new coastline, burying in places the very seagrass meadows the sea's grazers depend on, and the shallows where fish spawn. The city grew outward into the Gulf, and the Gulf gave up part of its living floor to make room. Here too the pattern holds. The sea provides the ground the city stands on, the water the city drinks, and the view the city sells, and it pays for all three at its own shallow edges. That certainty was bought with oil, and the two, the oil and the water, has been tangled together here from the very beginning, more tightly than most people realize. Consider how Saudi Arabia found its oil. In the 1930s, in the eastern deserts of the kingdom, engineers were drilling, and part of what they were drilling for was water, a reliable supply for the growing towns of the coast. What they struck instead, in the same ground, was oil. The thing that would make the kingdom rich was found while the kingdom was looking for the thing it actually needed to survive. Water and oil in the region come out of the same rock. Today, Saudi Arabia is the largest maker of desalinated water in the world. Along its Gulf Coast stand plants like Jubail and Ras Al Khair, industrial cities of pipes and towers that between them produce billions of cubic meters of fresh water every year, enough to supply whole populations and the farms and factories behind them. The oil pays for the energy unsalts the sea. The fresh water grows the cities, and the cities pump more oil. It is a closed loop, running on the one substance the desert has and the one it does not, feeding each other in a circle that has held for 70 years. There was another way the desert tried to stretch its water, and it is a cautionary one. For a time, Saudi Arabia set out to feed itself from the sand, drilling deep into ancient underground reserves, the fossil water laid down in far wetter ages, and spraying it in vast green circles to grow wheat. For a while it worked so well, the kingdom became a wheat exporter, an improbable green mirage seen from the air as perfect discs stamped across the dunes. But that water, unlike the sea, does not come back. It had taken tens of thousands of years to gather, and it was being spent in decades. As the reserves fell, the kingdom largely gave the effort up. The lesson was the one this coast keeps relearning in every century. The only water here that will not run out is the one thing you cannot drink without a machine: the sea. There is one of the six, though, that half escapes this story, and it is worth asking why. Of all the Gulf states, Oman alone has a mountain spine and a monsoon edge, catching a little rain the others never see. And Oman has a second coast entirely, facing the open Arabian Sea beyond the strait, where most of its people and most of its desalination plants actually sit. So while the other five drink the shallow, salt-heavy inner Gulf, much of Oman drinks the deep ocean outside the gate. Cooler, less salty, easier water. In the far north, the country keeps a strange, detached fragment of itself. The Musandam Peninsula, a maze of drowned mountains and sea cliffs that forms one wall of the Strait of Hormuz. From those heights, you can watch the entire traffic of the Gulf pass through the gap below. It is fitting that the one nation which drinks a gentler sea is also the one standing guard over the door the rest of them cannot live without. And all through those 70 years, in the same warm shallows the pearl divers once worked, another kind of survival has been going on. One that owes nothing to oil and everything to the sea's punishing extremes. This is the hottest sea on Earth. In high summer, the surface of the southern Gulf can climb past 35 degrees Celsius. Water warm as a bath, warmer than any open ocean anywhere. For most coral reefs, that is a death sentence. A tropical reef begins to bleach and die when the water holds just 1 or 2 degrees above its normal summer maximum for too long. The corals of the Gulf live, year after year, in water that would kill almost any other reef on the planet. They do it through a partnership so small you would need a microscope to see it. A coral is not really one animal but two: the coral polyp and a tiny alga that lives inside its tissue and feeds it. In most reefs, when the water gets too hot, that partnership breaks. The alga is expelled, and the coral, starved, turns white and dies. But the corals of the Gulf carry a different partner, a heat-tolerant alga that science only recently identified and named, one found in abundance nowhere else in the world. It holds the partnership together at temperatures that would shatter it anywhere else.
They did not always live like this.
When the last ice age ended and the seas rose, this basin flooded and warmed, and over roughly the last 15,000 years, the corals trapped inside it either adapted to the heat or vanished. The ones that remain are the descendants of the survivors, a reef that spent 15,000 years learning to live in an oven. Which is why marine biologists now come here from around the world, including researchers like John Burt at New York University Abu Dhabi, who study these corals not as a curiosity, but as a possible future. Because the water the Gulf's corals already survive is the water that reefs everywhere else, the Great Barrier Reef, the Caribbean, the Red Sea, are only now heating up toward. The Gulf is, in effect, a laboratory that ran the experiment 15,000 years early. If the reefs of the warming world are going to make it, the answer may already be alive in the hottest sea we have. For all its punishing heat and salt, the Gulf is not a barren sea. It is a crowded one. More than 700 kinds of fish move through it. Whale sharks, the largest fish alive, drift in through the strait to feed. Humpback dolphins work the shallows. 5 species of sea turtle nest along its beaches. Somehow, in the hardest water most of these animals will ever meet, a whole living world has packed itself into the shallows, proof that harshness and abundance are not opposites, and that a sea does not have to be gentle to be full. And the corals are not alone in the improbable business of surviving here. In the shallow, sun-warmed meadows of seagrass that carpet parts of the Gulf floor, grazes an animal most people have never heard of and would struggle to believe. The dugong, a slow, gentle, plant-eating mammal, a cousin of the manatee, up to 3 meters long and heavy as a small car, moving through the seagrass like a gray shadow. It is the only fully vegetarian mammal in the ocean. Sailors who glimpsed them nursing their young at the surface centuries ago mistook them for something half-human, and the dugong is very likely the seed of the world's mermaid stories. Nowhere outside Australia are there more of them than here. The Gulf holds the second largest population of dugongs on the planet, thousands of them, grazing the meadows off Qatar, Bahrain, and the Emirates. Off the coast of Abu Dhabi, a marine biologist named Mather Al-Hameli has spent 2 decades following them, mapping where they gather so that those places can be protected. They are slow to breed and easily hurt, caught in nets, struck by boats, driven off by the dredging and building of new coastlines. And yet, in a sea that is warming, industrializing, and being drunk by 6 nations, they are still here, still grazing the same meadows, and in places their protected numbers are holding. Abu Dhabi has replanted thousands of hectares of the mangroves and seagrass they depend on, rebuilding deliberately the nurseries the sea needs. To see what this sea is at bottom, you do not even need to look at the water. You can look at the land it leaves behind. Along great stretches of the southern shore lie the sabkhas, flat, blinding salt pans where the Gulf, at its shallowest edges, floods in, sits under the sun, and evaporates completely, leaving nothing but a crust of salt and gypsum baking white to the horizon. A sabkha is the sea's own signature. It is the exact same process the 6 countries run inside their plants. Fresh water lifted off, salt left behind, only run by the sun across open ground and carried all the way to its end. Every fountain in every city is a small, expensive argument against what the sabkha quietly shows you. That in this climate, left alone, water does not stay. It rises and leaves the salt. Across the water, along the far northern shore, the Iranian coast runs mountainous, green in the patches where rivers still reach the sea, its rough islands like Keshem standing guard over the deep side of the strait. It is a reminder that this sea has 2 shores and more than one name, and that its salt, its heat, and its single narrow gate belong to everyone who has ever lived around it, whatever they choose to call it. The sea, then, is not a dead resource being pumped dry. It is a living, adapted, ancient thing, and the 6 countries are drinking it. Which brings us back to the question underneath everything. If you take fresh water out of a sea that is already trying to turn itself to salt, where does all the salt go? Because that is the catch in the whole miracle, the part that does not appear in any brochure. Desalination does not create fresh water out of nothing. It divides seawater into 2 streams. The fresh water that goes to the taps and everything left behind. A hot, heavy, concentrated brine, saltier than the sea it came from, that has to go somewhere. And there is only one place to put it, back into the Gulf. So the 6 countries are doing, deliberately and constantly, the exact thing the sun already does to this sea. They pull fresh water out, and they pour concentrated salt back in. Every year, more of it. The plants that made the coast livable are, at the same time, making its water heavier, and the amount is not small, and it is not finished growing. The region's thirst rises with its population, and the volume of brine returning to the Gulf is set to multiply in the decades ahead. The scale is difficult to hold in the mind. More than 400 desalination plants now ring this one sea and its approaches. Together, the Gulf states pull in and process well over 20 million cubic meters of seawater a day, very nearly half of all the desalination done anywhere on Earth, drawn from a single shallow basin you could cross in a day under sail. And for every unit of fresh water that leaves for the taps, a heavier unit of brine goes back the other way. The Gulf is being run, in effect, as the largest machine on the planet for separating salt from water, and the salt has nowhere to go but home. Right at the outfalls, the places where the brine pours back in the shallow southwestern corners of the Gulf near the Arabian shore, you can measure the cost. The water there is saltier and hotter than it should be. It carries the heat and the chemicals of the process. And the marine life closest to the pipes, the seagrass, the shellfish, the small creatures that cannot swim away, pays for the water the cities drink. The sea endures. The shoreline beside the plants does not always endure with it. And there is a cost that never touches the water at all. Unsalting the sea takes a staggering amount of energy, the heat to boil it, or the pressure to force it through the membranes. And for most of the last century, that energy came from burning the region's own oil and gas. Which means the machines that let these countries endure the heat have also, in their small way, been helping to make the world hotter, and the Gulf hotter, and the water they draw a little harder to cool. It is the tightest of all the circles here. The sea is drunk to survive a climate, and the drinking helps drive the climate it must survive. The newest plants are quieter about it, lighter on power, and some of them run increasingly on the region's ferocious sunlight, turning the other thing the desert has in abundance into the water it lacks. Whether that shift arrives fast enough is the open question hanging over the entire coast. Which leaves the largest question of all, the one the whole story has been building toward. If this goes on, if 6 thirsty nations keep pulling the fresh out and pouring the salt back year after year, more every year, why doesn't the Gulf simply keep getting saltier until one day it becomes too salty to drink at all? Why hasn't the miracle already begun to poison itself? The answer is at the far end of the sea, in a single narrow gap. And it is the most quietly astonishing thing about this entire basin. Everything drains through the Strait of Hormuz. The Gulf has only one opening to the wider ocean, a gate barely 56 kilometers wide at its narrowest, hemmed in by the mountains of Oman on one side and Iran on the other. Every drop of water that enters this sea and every drop that leaves it passes through that one gap. And what happens there is not a simple in and out. It is a conveyor, a slow, permanent circulation that runs on salt itself. Here is how it works, and it is worth slowing down for, because this single mechanism is the reason 6 countries can drink this sea and the sea survives it. The sun evaporates the Gulf's surface and leaves the water behind saltier. Salty water is heavy, denser than fresh, so it sinks. Down at the bottom of the Gulf, along a deeper trough that runs the length of the Iranian coast, this heavy, salty water slides slowly toward the strait and pours out along the seafloor into the deep ocean beyond. And to replace it, fresher, lighter water from the Indian Ocean flows in at the surface, over the top. The sea is breathing. Salt out along the bottom, fresh in along the top, endlessly through one narrow gate. Now add the brine, everything the 6 countries pour back. It makes the coastal water a little saltier, a little heavier. And here is the thing that a mathematician named Francesco Paparella, working at New York University Abu Dhabi, showed when he modeled the whole basin. That extra salt does not just sit there and build. Because heavier water sinks faster and flushes out faster, the saltier the Gulf's coastal water becomes, the harder and quicker the strait pulls it out to sea. The very thing you would fear, rising salt, speeds up the process that removes it. The system pushes back on itself. It means that even under the heaviest scenarios anyone can model, decades of rising desalination, a hotter climate, far more brine than today, the salinity of the Gulf as a whole barely moves. The strait keeps pace. It is not a reservoir slowly filling with salt. It is a kidney, a narrow, tireless organ at the end of the sea, taking the salt the 6 countries pour in and the sun leaves behind, and quietly passing it out into the Indian Ocean, keeping the whole improbable arrangement in balance. And it is not only salt that leaves through this gap. The same 56 kilometers of water carry out something close to a fifth of all the oil the world moves by sea, the crude, that paid for the plants that drink the Gulf, funneled out through the very doorway that keeps the Gulf drinkable. Everything this coast lives on in the end threads through one narrow strait. The salt going out along the bottom, the oil going out on the surface, the fresh ocean coming in over the top. 3 lifelines braided through a single gap in the mountains, each of them holding up a way of life that could not exist without it. Sit with the full shape of it. 6 nations with no rivers, no lakes, and no natural way to survive, drinking a sea too salty to drink. A sea that should, by every intuition, be growing saltier under the strain. And the only reason it does not, the only reason any of it holds together, is a 56-kilometer gap of moving water at the far corner, exhaling the salt as fast as the sun and the cities and the plants can make it. The pearl divers held their breath to go down for something rare. The whole sea, it turns out, has been holding a breath of its own the entire time, drawing fresh in, pushing salt out through the one doorway it has. It is not a perfect balance, and it would be a lie to end there. The strait protects the sea as a whole. It does not protect the shoreline. Near the outfalls, the salt still builds, and the life there still pays, and no basin-wide arithmetic makes that untrue for the seagrass dying beside a pipe. The system holds at the scale of the sea. It frays at the scale of the creature. Both of those things are true at the same time, which, if you have been paying attention, is the shape of every true thing about this place. And there is one more truth beneath all the others, the one this whole coast keeps proving and the world keeps forgetting. We tell the story of the Gulf as a story about oil. The tankers, the wells, the sudden fortunes, the skylines paid for in crude. But the oil was always the easy part, the thing the ground gave up almost by accident, found by men who were drilling for something else. The hard thing, the thing 4,000 years of pearl divers and dhow captains and spring finders understood in their bones, was never how to get rich. It was how to get a drink. The real scarcity here was never oil. It was water. It always was. It is easy to forget, standing in one of these cities, how much sits behind the simplest thing. A child in Doha or Dubai or Kuwait City turns a tap and fills a glass, and the water is cold and clean and seems as though it could never end. Behind that glass stands a power station burning gas, and a plant the size of a town pulling the Gulf apart into fresh and salt, and a lattice of pipes and towers and pumps threading it inland, and beyond all of it, the sea itself, and beyond the sea, a narrow strait breathing the salt back out as fast as it comes in. The entire apparatus exists so that the glass can seem ordinary. Nowhere on Earth is a glass of water the product of so much, and nowhere is it taken more for granted, which is perhaps the surest sign of how completely these 6 countries have won their long argument with the desert, at least for now. In the shallows off these coasts, on quiet beaches between the plants and the ports, a critically endangered sea turtle still holds herself out of the water at night to lay her eggs in the sand, exactly as her kind has done since long before Dilmun, long before the first sweet spring was ever found. The hawksbill turtle does not know that the sea she was born in is the hottest on Earth, or the saltiest inhabited water in the world, or that 6 nations are drinking it. She knows only the beach and the tide and the ancient instinct to return. She is still returning. That is what this sea is in the end. Not a resource and not a warning, but a bargain, struck 4,000 years ago and renewed every single day. 6 countries that had no right to exist where they exist, drinking a sea that had no reason to let them, held in balance by a single narrow gate and a handful of stubborn, adapted living things that refused to leave the hardest water on the planet. The springs of Bahrain are nearly gone now, drunk dry by the cities that grew above them. The pearls are a memory. But the thing the springs once did, the small daily miracle of pulling something sweet out of the salt, the 6 countries now do at a scale the Dilmun people could never have dreamed. They did not inherit an easy place. They manufactured a way to stay, and the sea, breathing salt out through Hormuz, lets them, for now and for as long as the gate keeps holding its breath. Thank you for spending this time with us on the sea that 6 countries drink. If you'd like to keep exploring the places the world thinks it already understands, subscribe and travel on with us. Until the next